It's great to be with Amy and Ryan Green, award-winning game developers. Could you introduce yourselves to us, please?
Sure, I'm Amy Green,
I'm Ryan Green. I make video games.
and I help with some of the writing and directing of video games, and we work with Numinous Games, which is a studio that
We founded with Josh Larson about 7 years ago.
Amazing, amazing. And you, together with Josh and Numinous Games, you made That Dragon Cancer, which has won many awards. And I know lots of people have called it not just a game, but also a memorial. So for those who don't know the game, can you tell us who is the game memorializing?
Sure. So our son, Joel Green, he was our third son, and he was diagnosed with a brain tumor when he was a year old. And just before he turned 2, we learned that his tumor was terminal. His tumor came back. They'd already done the most intense treatments they could, and they didn't really have any other options to offer us. So at the time, they gave him maybe 4 months to live, but we actually saw him respond to palliative treatments better than we expected. And we ended up having a lot of extra time with him. Mm-hmm. It gave us time to kind of think about how we could share his story with other people and how we could talk about what it is to care for a terminal child. And with that extra time, we started to think about, maybe sharing the story of Joel in a video game.
And so Amy and I are creative people, and this is the way we express the things that we're going through.
Right. And when you started work on the game, where did you think the game was going to end up?
Well, the reason we decided to create a video game was actually based on an experience that I had with Joel shortly after his terminal diagnosis, where I was in the hospital with him, and he was in a lot of discomfort and a lot of pain, and he'd been crying relentlessly the whole night. And no matter what I did, all those tricks that fathers learn to do, no matter what I tried, nothing would bring him comfort. And it was one of those moments where I was at the end of myself, and desperate and weeping and crying and wanting to help him. And in that moment of prayer, we found respite. Joel stopped crying, and he slept peacefully. And it was one of those few moments in my life where I kind of felt directly seen by God. And that was a moment that I wanted to share with people. Because while we were in the midst of something so devastating, something that we couldn't control, there was those moments of grace that we wanted to share.
And when we started developing the video game, we had seen a lot of these moments where it felt like God was answering our prayers, where Joel was responding in miraculous ways. And we thought, as we started creating this video game, that we were going to be sharing with the world a testimony of a miraculous healing. And this was our way of sharing that story. We thought we were living something that seemed almost unbelievable to us. And it's really hard to describe that to people now, because now everyone knows that Joel didn't live, but we thought he would. We had seen so many little miracles along the way that we thought we were telling the story of a miracle.
Right. And so as kind of like journalists of our own life, we were thinking, what are the ways that we can use the creative tools that we have to live our story out in front of the world in those ways? Because ultimately, what we hope to testify to is the faithfulness of God.
And you came up with the name That Dragon Cancer. Where did that name come from?
Go ahead.
Well, the first time that we were told that Joel was probably about to die, this happened a few different times. He'd have these recurrences. But the first time we were told that Joel was about to die, my dad, on a phone conversation with me, told me, I think what would be really important is if you could let your other sons know, if they could understand that Joel fought very hard and that God was so proud of him, and that if he does die, that he earned his rest, and that God was so, so pleased with him and how he fought. And I struggled with how to talk about these concepts with my kids, because they were 5 and 3 at the time. They were itty bitty. And they knew we were praying for Joel, and we were wanting to teach them about faith, but part of that was also teaching them about the potential loss that we were facing. And so to put it in their terms, And to not give them more information before they needed it, I decided to start telling them this bedtime story of Joel, the brave baby knight, fighting this dragon called Cancer. And so every night we could tell a little more of the story, and we could kind of paint a picture for them of what was at stake without having to get to the end before we were ready to get to the end of the story.
And the dragon's a really interesting character in Scripture, particularly in Revelation when it talks about that great red dragon and how he kind of declared war against the woman and her children. And that picture was just the sense that we felt, that cancer is something that comes against us and our children. And that, great accuser also comes after us. And so in that we found that the symbolism of that spoke to like the struggle of our faith at kind of all levels.
So it's quite a scriptural symbol, that dragon, but also I guess in computer games there's that concept of like the boss at the end of the level that you need to get past to get victory. And so there's really interesting synergy with that. Tell us, as like game developers, tell us how do ordinary games work? On what sort of priorities and principles does your average game kind of work?
I think most people would say that the very best thing about a video game is that you are in control of it. Like, you have agency. If you fight well, then you'll perform well. And the more you practice, the better you get. And that there's a way to overcome every obstacle. It's designed in such a way that you have a goal to achieve and there's obstacles in your way. And hopefully, if it's designed well, those obstacles are just a little more challenging than you can quite manage at first. And you're eventually able to overcome them either as you practice and get better or as you achieve some kind of like power up or special bonus. So that each little challenge along the way to this ultimate goal is something that has to be overcome. It's not too easy to overcome. It's not too hard to overcome, but it's designed so that you, as you make choices and as you practice and get better, are able to like slowly beat the game.
I think video games are a conversation between the designer and the player, where the designer is trying to tell the player something, and they do that through giving them little bits of information, a little bit at a time that builds on each other. And so once you establish that vocabulary, that language between the designer and the player, then there's this invitation to play, right? To challenge, to learning and to mastering. And at every step of that way, there's an opportunity for the designer to be telling the player something and for the player to be telling the designer something.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned words like mastery and control, agency, but I guess as you were going through treatments with Joel, that was probably the opposite of what you were experiencing: mastery, control, agency.
Yeah.
I remember Ryan telling me about this night he had in the hospital with Joel where nothing he did was working. And that night he even called me and he was like, you have to come here, like find someone to watch our other kids. You have to just come be here with me because this is so hard and I don't know what to do and I don't feel like anyone can help me. And I was, making those arrangements to try to have someone come over and stay with our kids so I could go to him. And then he called back and said, it's okay. I prayed and I just felt like I was supposed to thank God for everything he'd done so far. And when I was done praying, Joel slept finally and he felt better and I didn't need to come. But later, as he would talk to me about what that night felt like, he said it felt like playing a video game where all the mechanics were broken. And so that concept really stuck with him. And was something that he kind of believed in, this idea of like, sometimes there are moments in our life that we think should work a certain way. As a dad, you have all the tricks, right? Like you bounce the baby or you sing to the baby, or, you just have these things in your tool belt that you pull out and they usually work. And so what do we do when they don't work? Because I think we all have those moments in life where things don't work the way they always have, where we feel like we have no agency and no control. And certainly that's what fighting cancer feels like once you've been at it for a while. I think right at the beginning, you do the thing that new parents do at the beginning of being parents, where you think, I'll make all the right choices. And if I just make all the right choices, this is going to be okay. And so when you're fighting cancer, you think the same thing. We'll make all the right treatment choices. We'll do everything just right. We'll follow the doctor's instructions everything will be okay if we do this right. And then I think you gradually get into a place where you realize that actually the outcome has very little to do with you. And most of the choices you make aren't very meaningful choices. And so it was a wrestle to be able to kind of rest in that place of going, I don't get to control this. And all I want to do is fix it. And I'm not able to.
And so how personally do you cope with that? How personally do you cope with the uncertainty and seeing a loved one just so helpless themselves? I mean, what resources did you have to get through those years?
Oh, I don't know. What were the resources that we had to get through those years? I feel like in many ways that hope of deliverance kind of anchored us, in all the things that we were being tossed into to and fro in. That hope that he would be delivered, that hope of heaven, is the thing that, it's the beacon, right? It's the lighthouse. It's the thing that you look to when, all the waves are just overwhelming. And I think in that was the waypoint for us, I suppose.
I do think that we grew in our faith a lot that year because I think faith gives you a picture for grace that extends beyond circumstances that are too big for you, circumstances that are overwhelming. And that's where we found ourselves, was in a situation that did feel too big and too hard and too scary. But we had faith that there was a loving God who cared for us and who was taking care of us and who was in this with us and was walking alongside us and alongside Joel. Yeah. And so it's certainly, I think, the biggest thing we turn to, along with, of course, the support of our friends and our family and our church. And I think what we found is that those years when Joel were sick were not nearly as sad and desperate and scary as we expected them to be. There was a lot of hope and a lot of joy. And you start to get a picture of the preciousness of life that we simply didn't have before that. Mm-hmm. Everything Joel did was amazing to us because it wasn't a guarantee that he would do it. Wasn't a guarantee that he would walk. So when he did, it was incredible. Any little words he said were amazing to us, even though he never had more than a few words. He never even achieved things that his brothers achieved, but even his tiny achievements were so important to us.
We got to make it our occupation to care for Joel and to talk about him and to talk about all the things that we were learning in that process. And so I think in many ways during Joel's illness, that gave us purpose. In a situation where we didn't have any control, it was the one thing that we could do. And so I think I clung to that a lot. And just that aspect of being able to tell his story well.
Mm. And that's what's so beautiful about playing the game. Not only there are those moments of joy when you can be with Joel and, racing down the corridor of the hospital and that sort of thing, and those moments, but also, you invite us in to love him and to be with him through that. And it's just, absolutely. Such a beautiful testimony you've created there. Tell me, I mean, this is a ridiculously impossible question, but if someone looks on and they're from the outside of the faith and they can't understand why you would still believe in a good God when you have to walk through this kind of valley, what would you say to that?
I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good answer for why God allows children to get cancer and die. I don't. I look at creation and I see a creation at the mercy of death, at all levels. And so I think regardless of how we feel about God, we can look around creation and see the state it's in. And so what I look for in the midst of such suffering is where are those beacons, right? Like, where is that point of light that we follow? Where is where else would we go? And I see in the example of Jesus, in the teachings of Jesus, life and the hope of life. And so in that regard, that's what keeps me walking that direction in the midst of all of this.
I mean, it's certainly something. I mean, it's the question that everyone asks, right? Like, how could a good God allow these terrible things? And after Joel died, it's the question I asked myself, because I felt like he was encouraging us to have faith and to believe for Joel's healing. And so then when Joel died, after years of miracles, I felt like the rug was pulled out from under me. And I felt like, I don't even know God. And how do I even know if God is good? And if God loves me but would let my child die, then how can I say that he's good? And who is this God? And I had to really wrestle with that and ask a lot of hard questions. But I will say that in asking those hard questions, I really felt like God was in the suffering with me, and that he gave me answers to some of my questions, and that he showed me things and shifted my perspective a little bit. But one of those things that shifted the most as I contemplated this, like, what do we do with a God who is love, but who allows really hard things, is that I shifted my perspective a little bit on suffering. Suffering felt really unfair to me when it was my child who died. I felt like that suffering wasn't fair and I shouldn't have to suffer. And I guess what I gradually started to see is that suffering is common. It's the common experience of man, that you can't buy your way out of suffering. You cannot be popular enough or famous enough or rich enough to prevent suffering. Everyone suffers. It's the thing that unites us to each other, and it's also the thing that creates compassion in us for each other. That I love people better because I understand suffering in a way that I didn't before. When I felt like my faith could make me immune to suffering, like maybe I could always count on God to get me out of suffering, I didn't have as much compassion for people who were suffering. But once I had really experienced the depth of the brokenheartedness of losing a child, when other people experience suffering, it doesn't feel like this distant, far off thing that could never happen to me. It feels like, oh, this is common. This suffering is the common experience of man. And I guess what I see in Jesus is someone who entered into suffering with us. So Jesus was called the man of all suffering, and his example to us as he lived was that he took on pain, he took on accusation, people lied about him, and he did his best to love people and to suffer for them, and to take on the greatest burden of suffering for us and to alleviate some of our suffering. But I just take a lot of comfort in the fact that he has felt what I feel, that he has felt suffering, and that, I mean, even on the cross, he cried out, God, why have you forsaken me? Well, after my son died, I felt forsaken, and I have comfort in knowing that Jesus has felt forsaken by God, that it's okay if I feel forsaken and angry, because it sure seemed like Jesus felt that same thing. And so I think that suffering is a thing that unifies us in a way that I didn't see before I experienced it. And so could a good God let me experience suffering so that I knew how to love people better and more fully and with greater compassion? I think he could.
I think there's a tendency in our Christian culture, at least where we are in the States, to equate righteousness and goodness with wealth and health and everything else. And I don't think many of us would outright say it, but there is kind of this overarching feeling, right? That if something bad happens, we're looking for the reasons that it must happen. And we're looking for the scapegoat, right? Because once we have a scapegoat, we can like send it out with all of our suffering and all of our sin. And so in that regard, I no longer am interested in finding out like why things happen, because there's no easy answer. It's really complex, and I'm more interested in how we treat each other in the midst of suffering. And I think that has been probably the biggest theological shift for me, is that shift in perspective.
Yeah. And it's so beautifully mirrored in the game, where you can make a lot of choices and you can do a lot of things and you can care for Joel along the way, but you can't alter the ending. This is the path that you must tread. this is horrible to ask you, but is there any way you can put words to what it's like when your son dies, like that moment in the game, the lights go out and it feels like the kind of the cathedral ceiling is about to fall on you. It lands on you with a weight, but that's just us playing a game. What's it like in real life?
That the last scene, or the second to last scene in the game, in the cathedral, where you enter this cathedral that is being built. It's like in the process of being built. There's a good cathedral, and there's a stained glass picture of me and Joel that's in the process of being built. And there's these edifices that we create for the glory of God, and in the midst of that, you hear the prayers of us as we're on the last night of Joel's life, and those prayers that you're hearing were actually declared in our home on the night of Joel's death.
Lord, rise up. My God, come save. I will not let you go unless you bless him. I will not let you go unless you bless him.
His life returned to him.
I will not let you go unless you bless him.
And so in that, you hear the mix of pain, and you hear the mix of a faithful declaration and being so full of faith and so sure that God is going to redeem. And you hear the cries for help. And in the midst of that, I think that there was a mix for us of expectation, so much expectation and so much disappointment. But there was also a peace, because we knew, we knew where Joel was at, and we knew what was going to happen, and there was a peace in that. And so that's the thing, like, regardless of the outcome, whether we thought he was going to live and be healed ultimately or to die, there was a peace in just being able to pour ourselves out in all of that. And I still don't have a good answer for how it feels. I feel betrayed in many ways. I feel like that God didn't show up for us in so many ways. However, what I do see in the midst of recovering from Joel's death and in mourning Joel's death is a change in our hearts. Like, we've been transformed through suffering. And I think ultimately, if we hold on to our hope that we'll see Joel again in heaven and have that pancake party and see all the dogs that he's assembled, like, I like to think of those things. I don't know what heaven is going to be like. It's probably nothing even close to what we imagine.
Definitely pancake party.
Yeah, exactly. Pancakes. Yeah. So yeah, we don't know, and all we can do is hope for it and be ready in a posture, to be ready for whatever comes.
There were definitely conflicting emotions, because we had this expectation that God was going to heal Joel, and I'd been praying for years that he would just do it in the way that was the most glorious. And so the worse Joel got, the more I thought, oh wow, like, there's this documentary crew that's filming us as we make this video game, and everyone can see firsthand that Joel's dying and that he's not getting better. And so this moment, like, on his deathbed, this would be the most glorious. And so oddly, like, the worse Joel was doing, the greater our expectation was building. And so there were a few things going on when Joel actually died. The first was that there was still this, like, hope that maybe even moments after he died, then God would raise him from the dead fully healed. Like, there was something in me that was still waiting, that still had hope, that was still holding on. But the other side of this was that Joel, most of his life, despite the fact that 4 out of his 5 years, he was fighting cancer and going through horrible treatments and really hard things were happening to him, most of his life he was a happy, carefree, delightful, joyful boy that didn't know he was sick because he was delayed developmentally. He didn't even know that he was sick. But in those last few weeks, he was not himself. He was suffering. He stopped walking and talking and swallowing, and his breathing got labored. And that last night, he hated having the oxygen cannula in his nose, that he slept a lot, but when he woke up, he was trying to pull the oxygen off. He hated it. And so there was a piece of me when he took his last breath that felt a little bit relieved for him. which is a hard thing to feel, but I knew that he couldn't go on like he was. I had this hope that he would be healed and be able to go on with us, like restored and able to finally really live life as the happy little boy I wanted him to be. But I knew that there was no way to continue forward on the path he was on. That we had already lost so much of who he was, and he was struggling. And so there was relief that the suffering was done for him, and then great sorrow that we didn't get the miracle we wanted, that we didn't get to enjoy seeing him healed and alive and well. And there's hope that he's in heaven and healed and well and living the life he never got to live here on earth, that he was able to develop and fully have that life. But then there's a lot of sorrow that I don't get to see him have the life I wanted him to have.
At what stage was the game at this point? And was your thought to mothball the game and put it on the shelf at this point, or what did you think?
When Joel died, we were about a year into development of the game, and the game ended up taking about 3 years to create. And honestly, when Joel died, it was the only thing I could imagine myself doing. I think had I not had that to work on, I would have completely shut down. And so this gave a purpose in that suffering, to honor him and memorialize him well. And in that process of doing that, like, we had to go outside of ourselves as well. And we had to ask for help. Because we did need to raise more funds to be able to keep going. And one of the things that happened is we did a Kickstarter. And part of that process was inviting people in to offer the stories of the people that they'd lost. And it was amazing to me.
Sorry, there's a train here.
It was amazing to me how people responded, because not only did they trust us when we weren't done telling the story, and knowing who we are and what we profess, that they were willing to both give their money as well as trust us with the memorial of their family members. And so we had numerous cards of people sending messages to the people that they love. We had artwork that was a mixture of art that some sick children had created, as well as pictures of grandparents or fathers or mothers that they had lost, as well as letters to other people that have gone on this journey, as well as, and I think most significant to me, the footprints of the children that they'd lost. And it's such a treasure to me that they got to add their voice to the thing that we created. And so ultimately this is an expression, not just of Joel, not just a memorial of Joel, but to everybody who has had to endure this kind of loss.
So the ending, the picnic at the end of the world, the pancake party, blowing bubbles at Joel, was that always going to be the ending? When did that kind of occur to you as the perfect ending? Because it is.
I think we struggled for a while with how to end the video game. That it was a conversation and a discussion of we thought we might go back to, we call it the park at the end of the world. We thought we might go back to that park, but we expected that maybe it would be Ryan and I going to the park. And I think from the beginning, Ryan knew that he wanted there to be some picture of communion there. The game starts with a loaf of bread and with a box of juice that for us is this picture of communion. And he knew that when he came back that he wanted there also to be this moment of communion. So we had some of these thoughts, but we weren't exactly sure how it would play out. But I remember one of the boys, I feel like it was Caleb, was telling me that he thought it might be nice at the end if you could just blow bubbles for Joel. And so we started to think about that picture. And throughout the video game, there's a mechanic that repeats where you have to give in to rest to move on. That there's this impulse to make the right choice or fix it or do better or continue or fight. But before you can move on, you just kind of have to rest and you have to kind of give up in order to move forward. And the game ends that way too, that if you wanted to blow bubbles for Joel, you could blow bubbles for Joel forever. But eventually you have to stop. Because in life you have to stop. And that was true, that there were moments when Joel wasn't doing well and he didn't want to play and he wasn't happy. And I thought, oh, if he could just if he just felt good, I would blow bubbles for him forever. I wouldn't stop. But then he gets better and he does a little better. And, you blow bubbles a little and then he wants to keep going, but you want to move on. And so those things happen. I could tell you now, because he's not here, that, if he were here, I would never shift my focus. But that's not true. Like, if he came back eventually, I still would shift my focus, because we're limited by time in that way. And so there is this moment at the end of having to, even in this last picture of Joel in heaven, having to let go and rest in that moment, and having to kind of give up.
Yeah, the picture at the end of the game is ultimately a picture of Sabbath, right? Of like the ultimate Sabbath, right? Like Jesus asks us to abide in him, and to strive, to work hard to enter his rest. And so in that way, a lot of what this experience taught me is that I can flail and strive and struggle and ask the whys and all of those different things, which are all good and they're all part of being human. But ultimately, I see it as a posture instead. And in that posture, there's this striving to enter the rest that he's provided for us, because the rest was created for us. And it's the invitation. So, and Amy talks about a picture of communion at the end. I did feel like I was trying to embed this picture of being present with Jesus in his body, right? And in that abiding with him. And ultimately that hope that we have, that when all of this is said and done, when we've been perfected through all of this suffering, that ultimately our rest is in him, and we get to spend time with him.
It's so interesting that you call it a sadness at the end, because every time I go through the game and get to that bit, I cry more than I have at any other moment. And I wonder, is that what people commonly say? Do they feed that back to you, that you're in floods when you see him again, in a way that I guess you've been holding back until that moment, but amazingly you cross on over to the other side and you see him again. And it's really I've been thinking about it for the last 3 years, when God promises to wipe away every tear, and you think, will there be tears in heaven? And I think your game helps me to realize, maybe really deep healing kinds of tears. Am I the only one who feels this about the ending?
I remember when we were building the scene, we were putting all the sounds in and all the animations in and everything. And I remember going into the scene and walking up the path to the park and Joel saying in the scene, "Hey, I remember you."
Yeah.
And I just burst into tears.
Yeah.
I hope for some good cries in heaven when we're reunited with those who we love, and when we kind of see the fulfillment of everything that we've hoped for. I don't think that crying is a bad thing. I think it's a receipt for the love that we have. And so in that regard, I kind of cringe at anybody trying to take away that pain, right? Trying to take away that receipt of my love. And so I think it's important to lean into it, because it helps us in so many ways.
Very deep theology of the cross there. So we're thinking about Easter at this time of year. Love to get your feelings on when you think about the cross and when you think about the resurrection. How does your experience with Joel kind of color how you see the cross, first of all, and then the resurrection?
Sure. Easter's tricky for us, I think, specifically because Joel died 4 or 5 weeks before Easter. And I think that first holiday that you celebrate without someone you love is really hard. And for us to have Joel have just died, and then all the sermons at church after that were about, Jesus conquering death and about the resurrection life, and to just hear that taught so much right after we'd lost our son was challenging initially, because in that moment, I did not really feel, there was, of course, the promise of resurrection life, but it was a small comfort, it felt like to me, compared to what I really wanted, which was for my son to be resurrected in this life, not in heaven, not one day, not that I would see him eventually, but that I wanted him here with me. So I think Easter is always a little bit of mixed feelings for us, but where I have come to be able to rejoice in the message of Easter, in that Jesus took on all of our suffering, that he died for us, and in dying for us paid the price for all of our sins, and that he was resurrected. And the Bible says that he is the firstborn among the dead. It's sort of this promise that, yes, Jesus was resurrected, but he's just going to be the first of many, that all of us will eventually be resurrected in that way. And so I think I've been able to come to rejoice in Easter as a promise. Our particular theology, we kind of grew up in a very charismatic background, and I think sometimes we lean toward this idea that everything Jesus accomplished on the cross is available for us right now, and so death has no sting, and we all have victory, and we're all perfectly provided for, and life has been completely redeemed. And that's a tricky message if that's not what you're experiencing. And I think that it's easy to look around at the brokenness of the world and say, really? Jesus died to make all of this better? Because I look around and I don't see it. But when I actually look into scripture, it says that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God and he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. So he sat down, his work is finished. He did everything he needed to do. The work is totally and completely done. And he's waiting for the results of that to be unfurled. And we see some of the results of the cross now. We see some victory and some life now. When you, I think, become a Christian, you experience life and joy in a different way. You feel the presence of God. You experience a taste of what that life is. But I see it more as a promise that there's even more life coming, that the work Jesus did on the cross is slowly being unfurled, and we will see more and more of it. And in heaven, that's when we finally get this full picture of what he purchased for us. We also like to, I think as Christians, quote that like, oh, and death will have no sting. But I think we think of it as this present tense thing, which again, it's hard to tell parents with a child that's dead, oh, death has no sting, because I can tell you, death stings. Like, death hurts. There's pain there for me. But the Bible specifically says that when all flesh has put on righteousness, then death will have no sting, and that it's pointing towards something in the future. It's this promise of future life, of future resurrection power. Not that we've already attained it yet, but that it is being released for us, and that work of releasing life to all of us began at the cross. And so there's so much to celebrate, because Jesus made a way for us to have life. He made a way for us to be reunited with him and with our son. And that's incredible, but I don't fully fathom it. I don't totally understand it. So sometimes that's still hard and confusing for me, but it's a promise that has been done and that I will see more and more of it.
Yeah, the cross to me has always been a strange bit of theater. The passion itself, I don't comprehend it. It feels in much way like a passion play, because I'm not sure what happened there. And I'm not sure of the fullness of how God and Jesus, who are one, were also separate. How his wrath was poured out, on Jesus, and why Jesus would say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Like, there's a lot I don't understand in that. But one thing that I've come to grapple with a little bit more is just this idea that regardless of if I understand what this passion play pointed to, I know that it was a very real thing in God, right? That something was shifted, something was changed, something was accomplished, and in that, like, I see hope, and when I look at the cross, I look at this invitation into deliberate suffering that I don't think I saw necessarily before. Like, this idea, we focus on the kingdom to come, and so we focus on that part that's like, and we're going to rule and reign with Jesus, and so we got to start ruling and reigning now. But I think that there's this other part of Jesus' invitation, and that is to follow me, to pick up your cross, and to choose to enter into passion, into compassion. And so what I look forward to is, it says creation groans in expectation for the sons of God to be revealed, right? And I think that's revealed in us putting on that compassion and following the example of Christ and choosing to lay down, our desires and our will and our rulership and all of those different things and love people. And so in that regard, like, I can do that now. I can do that now, not understanding everything that was accomplished, not being able to put in human words, human theology, what God did in that moment on Calvary. But what I can do is put myself in a posture of following Jesus. And that's what we've had to do. That's how we've had to navigate this time.
Yeah. Reminds me of that verse, Philippians 3, verse 10. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. And everyone says, amen. Yes, we like that. And then the verse goes on, and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And you're like, yeah, doesn't sound so nice, does it? But actually in Paul's mind, those two things are totally, you're going to need the power of his resurrection in order to walk the way of the cross and the way of self-giving love and the way of compassion and the way of taking on others' burdens and whatever triumph there is in the Christian life, it's the cross-shaped triumph, isn't it? Very much so.
I think it reminds me a little bit, just like in the context of video games and our video game, that if you think there's any way to win, you're not gonna lay down your life. You're not gonna give up. Like in our game, like when you're trying to figure out what you're supposed to do with the candles, if you think there's a pattern, if you think there's a way to solve it, you're going to do everything you can to solve it. And I think it's only when you realize this is so beyond me, it isn't for me to fix, I'm dependent on someone else, that you can finally lay that down. And I think walk in that level of sacrifice, of a laid down life, of the suffering that Jesus asks you to walk in. And I think we do that with our own lives, that as long as we think there's a chance that maybe we could get it all together, we're going to try. And as soon as we realize, like, oh, I'm really broken and I really do need help and I really can't do this on my own, that it makes it so much easier than to finally say, okay, my life can be forfeit in this process. I can really sacrifice. I can really give up on this idea of being enough.
I see a picture in our video game of, I just felt, so I see video games in a very spiritual, metaphysical way, because I feel like as video game designers, we get to create worlds and invite people into it. And so one thing that I'd like to say is that, we got to create a world and I got to place my son in it. And I asked you to love him and let that love change you. And to me, that is a small mirror of the promise of Christ, right? That God put his son into the world and asked you to love him and let that love change you. And yet he bore, all suffering, and and we get to see an example of the love of God for his children, but also the cost of all of it, the cost of all that love. And so in that regard, we get to reflect little pieces of God in the things that we create.
Is there a sense then when you get to the park at the end of the world and you see Joel, is there a sense, Ryan, that you also think this is kind of the welcome of Jesus as well, when he says, hey, I recognize you?
Yeah, I mean, because present in that picnic is just the symbol of communion, right? It's the symbol of
pancakes and sauce.
And, yeah, exactly. And scattered juice boxes everywhere. So, so in that regard, it's just it's this idea that like he named us, and he remembers us, and we're written in that book, and so like it's, to me, in many ways, this coming home. And it's a place that Amy and I weren't able to go yet. Joel is sent across the sea to the Grey Havens, or whatever you want to call it, if you want to get all C.S. Lewis-y and stuff. But just that promise of the far shore, And I remember people sharing pictures of that far shore with us, of Joel coming to greet us when we finally get there, of Jesus being there, and yeah, there's it's solace,
I think it's the great hope of faith that Jesus would know you, that you would be known by God and called to enter in. And so, yeah, we lived, I think, with the hope that Joel would be healed on earth, and now we live with the hope that we will join him in heaven, and that we will be recognized and we will be known and welcomed.
Yeah.
How have people outside the faith kind of responded to this game? Because you've immersed them in a world, and you with the letters that you write to one another, you're very open with your faith and that sort of thing. How have people who haven't shared your faith responded?
Warmly. We find that when you come with your testimony, they give you a seat at the table because they want to hear it and understand you. And I think in that space of just sharing our stories, there's no war, right? There's no conflict. There's just sharing in that suffering. And I think in many ways we've had some people write, like, it gave me a glimpse into the way that people of faith view death and view suffering, which is maybe foreign to them, right? They didn't grow up with that context, or they don't understand it. And so I think we found that approaching the world with that vulnerability, of that willingness to look like fools, right? And that willingness to have our declarations like not really come to pass, right? In those bold prayers maybe not going answered in the ways that we wanted them to. We found that we found good company in the world, because they've shared all of those things and they shared all those questions. And I think one of the most surprising things people come to us with is they're surprised because they said, I didn't know that Christians had these same questions. And so I think in that regard, like us opening up to the wrestle of our faith and the disappointment of our faith, but also the miraculous things that have happened, and also the places where we feel seen by God, that whole mix is something that people were really willing to listen to.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of times when Christians want to make art, they focus on like what they can teach in the art or what they can preach in the art. And I think we started out that way. Yeah, but that we gradually realized that if we just told our story, there's nothing that is offensive in telling your own story, right? Like, someone doesn't have to fight me about my story because it's my story, but they might want to fight me about what I'm trying to teach them or what I'm trying to preach to them. They might say, that's not my opinion, but we're not telling them our opinions, we're telling them our story. And so I do think that helped a lot of people who might otherwise be really turned off from a game that had so much about Jesus and faith and prayer. We were surprised that a lot of the people who supported the game on Kickstarter or who wrote us and told us they loved the game would tell us, like, I'm not a person of faith, or I grew up in the church and I don't believe in that anymore, or I'm an atheist. And, they would tell us these things, but they did see something that they could identify with. And like Ryan said, they told us those are questions I have, but I didn't think that Christians had those questions. I thought those questions disqualified me from faith. And so I think that maybe we haven't done a good job as a Christian community of showing people that faith is a wrestle, that it's something that we struggle with. And so I think the fact that we were willing to show that it is a struggle and that it's a wrestle and it's something you have to deeply contemplate, and that you waver in it and you hold on to it, that something about that struck people as true. And of course, there's always a few comments about the game here or there in reviews that are like, it was like going to church. If that's what you want to do for 2 hours, I guess play the game. So there were certainly people that didn't know quite what they were in for and felt a little surprised. But we tried to be really open as we were developing the game, that our faith was a large component of it, because we didn't want anyone to feel like they were like, like surprised, like, wait a second. But for some people, I do think there was a little bit of that.
I want to be respectful of your time. We've spent an hour, and I know you've got a hard out at 1. So, shall I ask you about what's next for the Greens and what's next for Numinous Games? Would that be good?
Right. We've developed a couple of games that we've released since that Dragon Cancer, and I think we've enjoyed telling one thing that we've enjoyed in our game development since that Dragon Cancer is trying to find a way to tell other people's stories. We had this platform that we were given where we could tell Joel's story, and that meant a lot to us to be able to keep talking about him and share a little piece of who he was with the world, so it doesn't feel like he just had this life and left and now it doesn't matter, but that we can kind of help make his story matter. And so we've looked for games and projects where we can do that for other people, where we can help them tell their stories. And so we've been privileged to be able to do that in a couple of projects, and I think we continue to look for ways to do that. I've been doing some writing and speaking, and I'm working on a book about Joel, but specifically about what it was like for me to untangle my disappointment with God from my grief over Joel, and kind of how God answered those questions for me and helped me kind of rebuild my faith after it suffered a pretty damaging blow. And so that's what I've been focused on.
With Joel, since he was so developmentally delayed and had to suffer so many physical delays as well, one thing that remains close to my heart is looking for ways to create games and create space for all types of people with all types of abilities to be able to play together. And so that's a lot of the focus that Josh and I have been focusing on in our work with Numinous, is looking for ways to build games that everybody can play.
Love it. And so people can check you out. I guess there's thatdragoncancer.com, but also numinousgames.com. Is that your URL?
Yep.
Fantastic. Ryan and Amy Green, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.